e2 in order to defend g2. Perhaps seeing rook e2 as a potential for white to give an exchange back and start breaking down the black position, McDonnell now played knight c6, which ensures he will still retain the advantage even if white does decide to give back an exchange with the rook e2, which we can have a look at in a moment. Bourdonnais preferred to play instead b3, again keeping his position solid as rook c8 next, and some tactics were threatened. We can have a look and see what black might have played had white elected for the exchange sack idea instead. So say he plays rook e2, aiming to sack the exchange. Now bishop takes f3 is best for black, and if white wants to look for activity, he has to get his queen to d5 before knight d4 is played, preventing that move. So correct here is to delay taking the bishop and sack the exchange now with the rook takes e3. Playing instead g takes f3, and black remains with a good edge after knight d4. So rook takes e3, f takes e3, and now queen d5. And the whole point of the exchange sack is to play this move, although amazingly black is still better here. It shows great intuition from McDonnell. Precise play is required to keep the advantage. Next would come a forcing line. With the bishop a5 check, king f1 is the only reasonable move, but now comes e2 check, king f2, now queening would check, rook takes e1, bishop takes e1, and king takes e1. If instead king takes f3, now rook f8 check is winning for black. So king takes e1, now rook d7, which is the only move to defend the black position and retain a small advantage after queen f7 check, forcing king d8, and now queen takes f3, and black is a pawn up with two rooks against a queen, which is almost always an advantage. However, white is better developed and has more immediate activity, as well as a long-term bind on black playing d5 to give his rooks more liberty. He also has a bishop against a knight, which is the preferable side of that particular imbalance, generally speaking, but black will be able to play knight d4, and even at this far later stage of the game, his central dark square strategy will remain. From d4, the knight will exert a very powerful influence on virtually the entire board, and from this position there will be lots of play, but it has to be said that the edge will still remain with black, but this may well have been the best continuation Bourdonnais could have gone for. Okay, so let's return to the game continuation. b3 is what Bourdonnais has just played, and now came bishop a5, which pins the rook and stops any exchange sack ideas in their tracks. Once again, McDonnell finds the best move. Bourdonnais continued with a3, which was presumably prophylaxis against knight b4, and also given the option of playing b4 next to break the pin, but this was not best. According to the computer, king f2, breaking the pin immediately, was better. After bishop takes d2 and queen takes d2, white keeps his disadvantage to a minimum, but black still retains an edge. So a3, and now rook a c8. McDonnell gets his last piece into the game, and this is a good idea on general principles. Getting greedy and pawn grabbing on g2 would have been unwise and dangerous due to the open g-file. Quite wisely, he decided instead to put as much pressure on Bourdonnais as possible before taking decisive action. Not playing bishop takes d2 is also good because it keeps additional complications in the game, making it harder for white to defend as possible. We can have a quick look at knight takes g2 instead. King f2 is the only reasonable move, and this may be why McDonnell didn't want to play it, as this breaks the pin on the rook with tempo. Black can play knight e3, where white's best move is rook g1. taking the g file and threatening immediately rook takes g4. He can save his d2 rook instead, for example rook b2, but now bishop b6 is totally crushing, especially as the king is tied to defending the f3 knight, now that the g-pawn has been captured. Knight takes c4 with discovered check from the bishop is the big threat, of course, and no matter what white plays here, he's lost, so rook g1 is preferable. And now bishop takes f3 is strongest for black, despite allowing rook takes g7 check. King f6 is the only move to avoid a perpetual, and now comes rook f7 check to save the rook. And after king g5, king g6 incidentally instead allows a forced mate with queen takes d6 check. Allowing rook takes d6 and then rook takes d6 is a forced mate in 9. So king g5 is the correct move, and now h4 check, sacking a pawn to open lines. So king takes h4, now king takes f3, getting the piece back and forcing bishop takes d2 if black wants to stay in the game. But after queen takes d2, knight d4 check, and king f2, white has managed to equalize. There will be an interesting and dynamic battle ahead, but white's chances are as good as black's, and this is a great example of the dangers of pawn grabbing once again. By not taking on g2, McDonnell ensures that all lines into his position remain closed, thereby allowing himself to retain a solid grip on the position and apply ever-increasing pressure. Okay, so back to the game continuation. McDonnell has just played rook a c8. And Bourdonnais continued with rook g1, protecting his g-pawn, because he's been given the chance to do so. Playing instead king f2 to break the pin again allows black the powerful bishop b6, where best play continues bishop b5 because knight takes c4 with check was threatened, but now comes knight c4 check anyway. King f1 is the best response, and now knight takes d2 check, queen takes d2, and bishop e6, and black's advantage continues to grow. So rook g1, and next from McDonnell was a very interesting move, b5, a creative and very strong sacrifice from McDonnell. There's absolutely no harm in either giving up the pawn or opening the b file. On the contrary, it's very important to remove the bishop from this strong diagonal before undertaking further plans. And white is slowly getting crushed not only in the center but on both sides of the board. Bourdonnais now accepted the sacrifice with bishop takes b5, and next came bishop takes f3, and planning, knight d4 next, and powerful use of the c file, and removing the bishop from the important diagonal means that white's kingside counterplay is vastly reduced. And regardless of that, Bourdonnais figured he had to drum up something, and he recaptured with g takes f3, which is consistent with his previous play, i.e. rook g1, so he can get activity down the g file. But this move makes defending his position much harder. Preferable was bishop takes c6, preventing a later knight d4 and total domination. It's best for black to save his bishop now, as it avoids opening lines for white, so best play continues bishop h5, and now g4, and en passant is not possible as the knight would hang, but black can play instead rook takes c6, and after g takes h5, rook c1 check, where the only reasonable move is king f2. Now comes bishop takes d2, queen takes d2, allowing rook c2, which is going to win the queen, but gives white slightly better chances of holding out for longer than the game continuation. After, for example, rook takes g7, king f6, queen takes c2, knight takes c2, and rook takes a7 with a pawn for the knight. Okay, so back to the game continuation. Bourdonnais has just played g takes f3. And now comes knight d4. You're just going to have to hold on for a second when I get the correct game from the database. Here we go. Okay, McDonnell has just played knight takes d4, which is... sorry, just knight d4 is the last move. And there's menacing tactical threats like bishop takes d2 and then knight takes f3, or simply knight takes f3 immediately, picking up at least a pawn and a rook to go with the rest of the booty. This is very strong and easily winning for black, but the computer thought that bishop takes d2 was stronger, and the evaluation does give a significantly larger advantage to black at about 3.5 pawns as opposed to 2.5 as in the game continuation. Play here may continue king takes d2. If instead queen takes d2, knight d4 is totally crushing with too many threats to meet. Knight takes b5, knight takes f3, and rook c2, amongst others. So king takes d2 is best, but now comes knight d4, and as before, the huge threats of knight takes f3 and a c-file invasion. White is in a tactical minefield, and there is no escape from him. His best try is rook takes g7 check, where king f6 come with tempo because it attacks the rook. So rook takes h7, looking for counterplay with the passed pawn, but this allows a crushing attack. Knight takes f3 check, forcing king e2. Now knight d4 check, and king d2, and the killer move rook c2 check, where queen takes c2 is the only option. There's only one other legal move, king e1, where knight f3 is mate. So queen takes c2 is forced, and comes knight e takes c2, and black will win easily from this position. So it appears McDonnell missed a decisive attacking line, but with a position as strong as his was, there are several excellent options. We can have a look at the merits of what he did play now. After knight d4, bishop c4 is what Bourdonnais played, and this clearly proves that the pressure was too much and he's crumbled underneath it. This is an outright blunder, although even with best play his position was practically impossible to save. He had to try b4, giving up an exchange to try and save the game. This allows knight takes f3 check, king f2, and knight takes d2, but at least white has rook takes g7 check. If instead queen takes d2, then rook c2 wins, and if instead b takes a5, rook c2 again is crushing. For example, bishop a4, attacking the rook, so the discovered check isn't as dangerous. But now rook b2. The best white has is rook takes g7 check, but now again comes king f6, and after rook takes h7, knight takes e4 with double check, and white is busted. So rook takes g7 would be best here, and king f8 is best for black, and now rook d7 is the best that white can do. But now comes the crushing move d5, and again white is toast. Black can simply ignore the threat on his bishop here. Best play goes e takes d5, rook takes d7, bishop takes d7, and rook c2. This allows queen takes h7, and black must have nerves of steel to take these chances, but he's winning after knight e4 check. It's double check, and it forces king e1 to avoid mate, but now comes f3, and white is totally helpless against the threat of f2 and mate. He can give some checks and even win a pawn or two with queen h8, king e7, and now queen takes e5 check. Giving up the bishop is the best hope, but after king takes d7, queen e6 check, king c7, queen f7 check, king c8, queen takes f3 is the only continuation to save the game. But now the initiative passes to black, and he is of course easily winning with 4 pieces against the queen. Simplest and best is knight g2 check, and king d1. If king f1, then knight d2 check wins the queen. But now comes knight f2 check, king takes c2, and knight e1 check, winning the queen and the game easily. So we go back to the game continuation, which is bishop c4. So now comes knight takes f3 check, and again easily winning for black, but stronger was bishop takes d2 check, where it's best for white not to take the bishop and play instead king f2. If he does capture, the king takes d2, if he takes with the queen, then knight takes f3 check is going to win the queen. But now comes knight takes f3 check anyway, king c1, knight takes g1, and black's going to win easily. So king f2 is the best move, but now knight takes c4, b takes c4, bishop e3 check, king g2, bishop takes g1, king takes g1, and again black will win easily with 2 rooks and a knight against the queen. But what McDonnell did play was knight takes f3 check, and like I said, it's easily winning. King f2 is the only reasonable move. Playing instead king e2 allows knight takes g1 check with tempo and a winning position for black. So king f2, now knight takes d2, which is the correct capture. If instead bishop takes d2, now comes king takes f3, and suddenly the tables turn on black and white is winning. For example, knight takes c4, b takes c4, bishop e3, rook takes g7 check, king f6, rook takes h7 with counterplay.